Okay, so welcome to our Martyn's Law webinar. I'll introduce myself. I'm Becky Sutton and I'm a Claims Relationship Manager at Zurich. I'm joined by my colleague Lisa Maynard, who is Claims Relationship Consultant, and Steve McGee, who is Head of Specialist Casualty at Zurich. I'm pleased to introduce our presenters for today. Starting off will be Alistair Kinley, Head of Policy Development at Clyde & Co, followed by Helen Devery, who is a consultant also at Clyde & Co. The session today will be recorded and sent out to everybody after the event. If you can pop any questions that you've got into the Q&A, you can put them in as we go along and we will pick these up at the end. Any that we don't get an opportunity to address, we will try and pick them up separately and we'll send those out in an email afterwards. There'll also be an opportunity to leave some feedback, and we will be sharing a QR code towards the end of the meeting before the Q&A, if you wouldn't mind just providing us with some feedback. So it's very helpful for us to understand your thoughts on the session and any future sessions that you'd like going forwards. So that's enough from me now. I'm going to hand you over to Clyde for them to begin our presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Becky, and thanks to Zurich for having us along to talk about Martyn's Law today. What I'd like to do is just pull up some slides that we'll talk through. So just give me a moment to do that. Okay, that should be appearing now on your screen, and I'll put it in presenter mode. So there we go. So as you all expected, we're going to talk about Martyn's Law, formerly known as the Terrorism Protection of Premises Act, which was passed by Parliament last year and won't come in until around 2027 because the government's planned for a 2-year lead period. Obviously, we're in the middle of that, and there are quite a few things that we all need to know about and we all need to get on with before the Act comes in, probably spring 27, which isn't that far away as we speak today at the end of January 26. We really fairly formulaically going to have a look at how the bill is laid out and what the key sections of it set down, and describe in a little bit of detail, just really general principles, what the basis of the legislation is, what the expectations are, how it's structured in terms of an important distinction in tiering, which we'll come to in a few minutes, and then we'll look at the regulatory environment with a new regulator, a new regulatory function for the Security Industry Association, which will have oversight of the activity and the obligations here. And finally, we're going to look at some scenarios, really case studies, just to give a flavour of what sort of exposures, risks, attacks might be in front and centre of your minds, and what the responses might be from those that occupy premises and those that assist them in terms of risk management and risk transfer. So I'm just going to go into the Act and sort of run through it very, very quickly. But Helen, before I do that, anything you'd like to add at this stage?
Just to introduce ourselves, really, Alistair, I think you've given an overview as to what we're going to cover, but just something about Alistair and I have been presenting on Martyn's Law now for some time. I know that Alistair, you've been in consultation with the government and had conversations with them around its evolution, and I was involved in acting for one of the core participants in the Manchester Arena inquiry following the terrible events, and obviously the evolution of Martyn's Law has come about because of that. So it's just really our background before we dive into the overview of the law. So thank you.
Yeah, that is sort of fair point to just elaborate a little bit on that background. The legislation, as Helen hinted, has its roots in the government response to the awful events in May 17, where 22 people were killed at the Manchester Arena, and the inquiry into that identified a number of failings in various quarters amongst a range of stakeholders. One of the recommendations that those who occupy premises or who organise big events should take specific steps to look at their exposure to the risk of terrorist attack and plan appropriately and proportionately to respond to that exposure in advance. So this is about mitigation, risk management and response. And I think just, the final point of history, which is worth going into, is you'll remember that back in 2017, that was a Conservative administration, and the early birth of this legislation, sort of version 1 of it, was brought forward by Mrs. May's government and then Mr. Sunak's government, and by and large, the bill that was emerged under Keir Starmer's administration is identical to the previous legislation. So I think what's important there, I mean, this is sort of political nicety that it's agreed by all parties. I think that is really the important point. This is not a political with a big P subject. It's really about protecting citizens and protecting premises. And you can see in the quotation there on the right-hand side of that slide, that's actually on the first page of the Act. And that's the so-called long title of the Act. And that really summarises what the legislation is about. It pivots on control of premises or events, and the obligation is to take steps to assess risk, reduce vulnerability, and the risk of harm. So you can see from that there are very strong themes there of health and safety, public safety, and it touches, as we'll come to, on other areas, event licensing, fire safety, evacuation principles, all those sorts of things, but we'll touch on that in a moment. And just looking at the text of the slide there, you can see we've put the aims of it. I just summarised those a moment ago. And important and probably unusual is that this applies right throughout the UK, not just as some health and safety issues are really on England, Wales and Scotland. This does apply to Northern Ireland as well. And as I said, we're in the middle of a 2-year implementation period, which was put in place so that, on the one hand, businesses who are going to be subject to these obligations can understand a little bit and prepare for what this will look like. And I think on the other, so that the new regulator mentioned there at the bottom of the slide has got time to and resources to understand its role, set out how it's going to behave, and to get ready for what it needs to do when these obligations go live in 2027. So I mentioned a few moments ago that the bill effectively introduces tiers of a new duty. And this is fairly straightforward in that there's a basic or standard tier where there are certain obligations, and then there's an enhanced tier where, in addition to the standard obligations, there are another set of obligations that duty holders will be expected to adhere to. A couple of points really from the structure of these tiers. First is that although the numbers refer to capacities of more than 200 and more than 800 respectively, that is the capacity that it's reasonable to expect at the event. It's the attendance of people there. It is not the capacity of the venue. So if you were a business, say a regional theatre with 600 seats, and you were putting on performances that regularly attracted fewer than 200, but on occasion, perhaps Christmas pantomime attracted 400 or 500, then that premises would be in the standard tier pretty much for all time, not just for the purposes of that panto that I mentioned. So effectively, and the last point I want to make about these thresholds is that the threshold for the standard tier actually moved between the current government and the previous government. Initially, it was proposed that the threshold would be more than 100 people, and small businesses and community groups and volunteer-led organisations in particular pushed back very, very strongly on that when the bill was being scrutinised by the Home Affairs Committee, saying, and I think with a deal of force and evidence, that these sorts of obligations might be really, really difficult for them to achieve and might stifle quite a lot of worthwhile community activity, whether that's in relation to arts activity or volunteering or those sorts of things. And as a consequence, the Home Affairs Committee recommended that the government should look at that threshold, and it has been upped to 200 for the standard tier. 800 for the enhanced has remained the same as far as I recall. But this is by far not all of the premises in the UK that are accessible to the public. I think the estimates were that something of the order of 180,000 premises across the UK are going to be in scope, with something like, and this is from memory, so it's not 100% reliable, something like 25% of those, maybe slightly less, being in the enhanced tier. So moving through beyond that, there is one sort of principle I think that's very important before we go to a different part of the presentation, and that's that these steps in terms of risk assessment and response and mitigation, these are not absolute steps or an absolute standard. They are subject in the legislation to the phrase "so far as is reasonably practicable," which in effect is legal longhand for proportionate. And the phrase is well known and well established in the health and safety context. And it means that the organisation, so the occupier of premises, well, you might expect more than 200 or 800 folk, or the organiser of certain events, where one would expect more than 800 people to attend, has to undertake those activities and plan a response that is proportionate to the threat, also proportionate to their resources and the nature of the premises. And I think that's very important. It is a useful balance, but I would caution against that being seen in any way as an excuse not to do what you've identified as being necessary. The SIA will be testing responses and plans in due course, and I think anyone who falls short will inevitably not only be criticised, but be subject to compliance notices and potentially fines that we'll talk about a little bit later. But again, Helen, just before we go into the regulatory piece, but anything to add on sort of basic layout of the Act and the duties?
No, I think you've summed it up there, Alistair, in the context that quite a lot of the questions that we do get asked is around the standard of so far as reasonably practicable. And those of you who have responsibilities for health and safety in the workplace or have ever been involved with the various regulatory agencies will be aware of that. Sometimes there is from organisations that there is an absolute duty. So I think that's important. I think the other point that you made in the previous slide is that around qualifying events, well, Alistair, that's something that organisations also sometimes get a little bit confused about as to whether they're putting on events that are going to exceed the footfall that would take them from standard to enhanced. So it's around that really, and the Act has hopefully clarified that for the time being. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So just looking into this in a little more detail, the basis of the duty to implement these measures and notify the regulator rests on a responsible person defined in the Act. And unsurprisingly, that's whoever controls the premises or the event. And that is likely to be a company officer, probably a director. It needs to be at that level in the event of organisation, or it could be a corporate entity in itself, or it may just be a senior volunteer in respect of a community event. But the controller of the premises needs to designate a responsible person, and that we think is it's appropriate. It doesn't need to be onerous, but I think anybody who is fulfilling that role needs to be made aware of what they are expected to do on behalf of the organisation. And I think perhaps very importantly, they would need to check that any insurance covers such as D&O, etc., are going to protect them in respect of this activity. So, and slightly recapping on what the responsible person has to do in the standard tier and the enhanced tier. Just got 4 activities that lie within the standard tier, and these are mentioned in this language in the Act. Evacuation, evacuation, that's safe places within the premises. Lockdown and communication, and that's not just communication with security services, it's communication with your first responders and communication, if you can, with staff in the premises in the event that panic breaks out and you need to find where people are, where the vulnerabilities are, and communicate in the midst of an attack, which is going to be challenging, but is an appropriate way to respond and protect people, staff, and premises in the event of an attack. And also in the standard tier, and this is mentioned at the bottom of the slide, the responsible person has to notify the regulator of the premises. Doesn't need to notify the regulator of the plans to deal with those 4 points, but needs to notify the regulator of the premises. Then in the enhanced tier, in addition to those 4 points, there are some additional security measures, again, so far as reasonably practicable, that the responsible person needs to examine and put in place, dealing with monitoring, movement control, security, and information security. And clearly, in a large venue, perhaps where you've got e-tickets and the like, security of information and knowing where people are is really, really critical. And you can see at the bottom of the slide there, and this is new and this is different. I think this is potentially an issue to think about a little more deeply in the future. Not only must you notify the premises in the event that you're in an enhanced tier, but you also have to submit your security and mitigation plans to the regulator. And that is in advance of anything happening. That's when you prepared them. And if you refresh them or change them, you need to submit those changes to the regulator as well. And that is important because it arguably steps across a potential privilege or disclosure point. Currently, in the event of an incident, those plans would be known, the current plans would be known to the business, and they might have to be handed over by way of disclosure to prosecution or regulatory sanction, etc. But here in this setting, those plans will have been shared in advance. So in the event of an attack, the regulator, if they want to have a look at what happened and how you responded, they will know what you thought you should have done, and they'll be able to see in advance whether your response in practice matched up to your planning. And I think that is a point, as I said before, that needs to be thought about in a little more detail as we get into the full implementation and go live of the Act in about a year or so. So just to recap on the standard and enhanced tier, and I wanted to pass this on because it's from a very good fact sheet that the Home Office issued in the autumn, which is just a double-page fact sheet on the Act and what's expected. And you can see at point 2 there, it lists those 4 issues that I mentioned in the standard tier. And then at point 3, the additional obligations that apply in the, excuse me, in the enhanced tier. So that's definitely something to bear in mind, and worth going back to, I think, if you have any doubt about what the broad nature of these obligations and activities should be. I think that more or less takes us through the sort of structure of the Act and how it's laid out and when it's going to come in and what it looks like. Helen, you were going to look at perhaps some of this in practice in the large event, arena style or theatre style.
Life a bit, because the questions that we get asked a lot is, well, what does it look like and what should we be thinking of, what should we be doing? Now, this is for illustrative purposes, but for example, the large events, the qualifying events, what would it look like, this extra obligations in terms of protection of the premises? Things like the outer perimeter, bollards, CCTV, obviously the hostile vehicle mitigation, which has been an increasing sector, you know, a growing sector in recent years. The entry screening, which are in place. If any of you attend large events, you'll know that that's already in place in terms of ticket validation, bag checks, but also the internal circulation, patrol surveillance, crowd monitoring, and the stage and backstage access control, accreditation, and emergency systems as well, such as evac, invac routes, alarms, responders, and we'll touch on those with some of the couple of the case studies that we've got. In terms of the security for the events, those of you who have familiarised yourselves or seen it on the news as well about the findings in relation to the Manchester Arena inquiry, the first chapter of that really focused on the security at the event itself. And of course, when considering appropriate security, it's looking at the competency of those people that you're going to be employing, because sometimes the security teams can be quite young, quite inexperienced, and certainly that's something which organisations need to give due consideration to, around the competency of those people who are going to be tasked with the security and the patrolling of the areas. I think if you could have the next slide, please, yeah. Alistair. Alistair's very capably using the slides. In terms of the regulatory oversight as well, so the role of the SIA, so their role, and I think there's some questions that have been popping up I've seen in relation to this, and we will try and answer as many of those at the end of the session. Certainly the SIA, their role is to ensure the compliance with Martyn's Law through notification, plan reviews, oversight activities. The closest that we can sort of anticipate it being like at the moment is the sort of HSE type function. So those of you who are familiar with notifications and the role of the HRD through enforcement proceedings, will be familiar with that. But obviously it's as yet unclear, and they're certainly going to have a busy job in terms of considering you know, getting sort of on the ground running, so to speak, and how they're going to look at sort of the implementation of inspections in particular. The SIA is going to have authority to take enforcement action, including penalties for non-compliance with security regulations. Those penalties are, you can see the boxes there, as a one-off in the standard tier, £10,000 maximum, and then a daily rate of £500 as well. That's the potential. And in the enhanced tier, it's 18 million or 5% of global turnover. And the global turnover is worth mentioning because that's reflected in the sentencing guidelines that we have already. So that's a global turnover. It's not profit, it's turnover, and a daily rate potentially of up to £50,000 a day. So we're talking very significant amounts, which will be uninsured because they're fines and penalties, so they're not going to be insurable. The advisory and support role, besides enforcement, they're going to provide guidance and resources to help organisations. So again, one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, well, where do we go to find this? And there's going to be a lot of very helpful information that the government are going to publish, the SIA will publish, to provide guidance for the implementation, rather than necessarily going to external security agencies. I'm sure that many organisations will look for support externally, but essentially that is going to be your role and responsibility to implement them, and therefore looking to the SIA will be a very effective way of doing that. The collaboration, they promote collaboration between public authorities and private operators to enhance preparedness and public safety, bearing in mind that, you know, many of the attacks that we've seen in the UK, there has been the crossover between the public areas and also private operators. So that's something which they're going to actively promote, that collaboration, which I think some of the learning from the inquiry that we saw would actually that's a good takeaway point, and very much a positive aspect that's going to be promoted. So
yeah, just going back to Helen's point about the advice and support. The government and the SIA have been clear that they will develop this guidance, perhaps in consultation. That may not be formal public consultation, it might be kind of targeted consultation with, you know, you can imagine the sort of the leisure sector, or the organisations representing major sporting activities like the FA and the RFU and the like. But it's very clear from that Home Office fact sheet I mentioned a few minutes ago, that the government does not expect, certainly in the standard tier, that responsible persons will have any need to employ or commission expensive safety consultants to produce plans and activities to respect the legislation and comply with the duty. That's the point that came through quite clearly in the early pre-legislative phase. I mentioned the Home Affairs Select Committee was looking at the bill, and the representatives of the families of those killed in Manchester and of the voluntary sector and the nighttime economy in particular were very, very clear that lots of that activity operates on very fine margins, and employing external consultants or having, you know, extreme obligations here would potentially force them out of business or having to restrict their activities severely. And that has been well understood by government and the potential regulator. And as I said before, the duty is a proportionate one, and it's very clear from that material, and I expect it'll be equally clear in the material we'll see from the government and the SIA in the next year or so, that in the standard tier in particular, as I said, there is no need to use consultants, and material from government sources, other public sources, local counter-terrorism police, and perhaps even trade associations and insurers and brokers who are prepared to provide support may well be sufficient to help people understand this and deal with it appropriately. So we're just going to look at a couple of scenarios in relation to potential terrorist attacks, and it is, of course, in relation to terrorist attacks that the legislation is going to apply. And we'll look at, unsurprisingly, one in the enhanced tier, and first off, one in the standard tier.
The attack scenario, first of all, we thought it'd be useful to look at a standard tier, because essentially we thought that there's merit in choosing, obviously, two different scenarios. One thing I would say is that a really positive thing that I'm seeing with lots of organisations at the moment is they're actually going through mock scenarios themselves, which I think is very helpful in stress testing the resilience within your organisation. Some of you may have already done this with health and safety incidents, with a major business interruption issue, or also product recall. I think these scenarios are very good for going through with your organisation and the key stakeholders as well as your people. So we thought that we'd use a terror-related attack at a fashion retailer on a busy high street. They have a capacity of 250. It's a busy afternoon. Individual launches a knife attack outside the store. The staff member notices customers running and shouting. The initial moments are chaotic. The risk of panic spreading, quick decisions, actions required, several people injured outside with knife wounds, and also the psychological damage. The post-incident strategies and impact. The immediate priorities in these types of scenarios are the run, tell, hide principles. So these are the sort of the advice that organisations are giving to their people around preparedness for such an event. So what does that look like? It looks like the evacuation of the primary and secondary exits, evacuations, which means when in lockdown, where are the staff trained to go? They're trained to secure fitting rooms and using stock rooms, for example, as a place of relative safety. The communications. Now, all this again is part of the training and part of what staff. Perfect. Thank you very much. What staff are trained to do? Well, that's to secure the fitting room. To call the store manager responsible for liaison with the police. So somebody who has that knowledge, has that training, and the practical implications of this is that store manager, there may be more than one store manager. So have the relevant senior people within the organisation being trained on this run, tell, hide principle, so they would know who to call, when to call, etc. And the impact evident later, as Alistair talked about, in evaluating the effectiveness or otherwise of a planned response. Your documentation around the steps you have to prepare for this will be scrutinised, and that's something which often those of you particularly who've been involved in any regulatory investigation will know that flies in the face of normal protocols, but obviously the documentation has been prepared. It will be looked at and scrutinised very carefully in relation to the effectiveness of the response. The pre-incident risk assessment must demonstrate preparedness and staff awareness. Now, it's likely that you are going to have documentation within your organisation that's going to mirror some of this information. But what's important about the Martyn's Law requirements is that you need to have these in a separate folder, so to speak. It's a separate principle, it's a separate policy that you have. You may have information you can take from other policies, but you do need to have a standalone policy in relation to this. And it must be written and reviewed regularly. So if there's major changes, if there's a store refit, if there's a new layout, and obviously when staff change, recognising that in some organisations, staff turnover is going to be high. So these staff have to have, it's a rolling programme of training, essentially, in relation to that. So that's an example of the standard tier. If we could move to the enhanced tier, please. Next slide, thank you. So again, for illustrative purposes, and those of you who are operating in organisations within this, you may have already been looking at scenarios, but this is a high profile event space, high capacity, and it's an unsophisticated terror attack. So coordinated small cell attack during a sold out concert. The attackers are targeting entry points, crowded areas, using firearms and IEDs. Again, as before, the initial moments are going to be chaotic. There's a risk of panic spreading, quick decisions, actions required, many reported casualties and a wide range of physical injuries, psychological damage as well. I mean, one of the tragedies around the arena was obviously that many of those attending were very young, because it was the Ariana Grande concert. So we had a demographic of very young people within the area. Post-incident strategies and impact. Again, the immediate priorities are going to be neutralising the threat, securing the venue, evacuation and first aid, and the facilitation of that first aid and understanding how that's going to work within the organisation. Martyn's Law impacts evident later in evaluating the effectiveness or otherwise of the planned response. Remember, going to have to submit these plans with the SIA, so there's going to be scrutiny around their effectiveness. Medium to longer term issues on many levels. There's going to be inevitably the impact to people. That's the first and foremost, and for any organisation, it's your people as well as the victims. There's financial, reputational impact, there's media, regulatory activity and sanctions. Those of you who've been involved in any regulatory investigation will know how time-consuming, stressful and long these investigations can be. So you're in it for the long haul if this happens. So it's almost whether the organisation has the bandwidth to be able to cope with that. That's something as part of your preparation and preparedness training that's important. Obviously, potentially inquests, and from my experience, the inquest that became the public inquiry, and then legal claims thereafter. And it's going to affect a range of stakeholders. So people within your organisation, people outside your organisation, liaison with emergency services, with victims' families, etc. So those are the scenarios, and by all means, you're very welcome to use these. You're very welcome. Obviously, you'll create your own according to your own organisation, but it's something that it's certainly worth considering at this stage. And the practical points. So just before we go to the conclusion, essentially, Alistair mentioned earlier about the responsible persons considering questions of legal privilege. Legal privilege, those of you who have been involved in aspects of asserting legal privilege, and it's a whole talk all in itself, and more than happy to provide you with information about that if anybody wants it. But it's important that you're going to have to make these decisions very quickly in terms of what documentation, if any, is going to be subject to legal privilege, and whether actually you are going to waive privilege in relation to some of the documentation that you've already created, because it may promote the preparedness of your organisation, and also importantly appropriate representation in the event of that, and the practical aspects of the costs of that representation as well, because these events are very, very time intensive, and that's a practical consideration for any organisation. So I think that sort of wraps up really where we are in terms of the presentation today. I think we have got quite a few questions, I think. So
just before we turn to the questions, just one of Helen's final points towards the end of that slide alluded to, dealing with all of the aftermath, including the risk of legal claims. It's worth just pausing on that for a second. The Act is very clear. There's a section in it that says breach of this Act does not of itself give rise to civil liability. Now that sounds great and kind of comforting in a way, but I think that ought not to be taken at face value. It simply all it says, breach of statutory duty doesn't give right to a claim, but of course, breach of the obligation could well, in certain circumstances, mean there's a claim for common law, failure to act, an omission type claim. That sort of cause of action already exists. So I think, although the Act is clear that of itself there's no right to claim, I think it is worth bearing in mind that there may well be coexisting common law rights that could be triggered in the event of a breach, and that breach causing significant harm or exacerbating the harm that had been caused to those people that were at the event or in the premises at the time.
Yeah, and we've helpfully got, before we turn to Q&As, we would ask you if you would please, if you wish to provide feedback, which we hope you would, use the QR code there, which has been very helpfully provided to us by Lisa at Zurich. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, I think feedback on the content rather than the
technology. Yes, no, the technology will beg your mercy on that, but hopefully on the content, and we do apologise for that. These things happen, but I think if we turn, Lisa, I think you wanted to come in around some of the questions. I haven't looked at all of them yet, so I'm going to look at them. Obviously, conscious of timing, what we will do is we will reply to all the questions, whether we get through them all today, or we come back to you around that and we provide answers afterwards, which can be distributed by Lisa and her team at Zurich rest assured we will come back to everybody on it, and we're happy for the slides to be shared as well. I know some people have asked about that as well. So shall I open up the Q&A?
Yeah, so firstly, before we go to the Q&A, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Helen and Alistair for a really informative session. I think you coped very well with the technology. It's one of those things you can't really plan for, so you did very well. And thank you to the audience for your participation and for all the questions. So if we start, so I have popped, sorry, just before we go to the Q&A. So as Helen said, the QR code is on the screen for the feedback. I've also popped the link in the chat as well, if you prefer to access the questions that way. The first question then is, do these tiers extend to schools stroke educational facilities?
I can take that. There is an answer in the Act, and there is specific tiering for educational institutions. Schools, primary schools and secondary schools subject to the tiers, but from memory, universities are also, but there is specific setting in the Act, and we didn't get around to that. It is a point of detail that certain premises are preset into particular tiers, be that education, places of worship, are the notable ones, and they are preset into tiers regardless of the attendance or capacity. We'll go back to the statute and we'll make that clear in our response, and we'll share those responses. Yeah. Good question, though, and worth reminding that on the face of it, attendance capacity is the way to understand the scope, but that presetting in certain commercial, industrial, arts, education sectors can override what otherwise would be standard or enhanced tier thresholds.
Right, thanks, Alistair. So the next question, we had quite a few questions around this. So it says, if the attendance levels in the tiers, do they apply to both indoor and outdoor events?
I'll take that one as well. The attendance levels are primarily, first and foremost, for premises, and I think we need to remember that this is Protection of Premises Act. That's the name of the legislation. So we're thinking about premises. In respect of events, events can take place within premises and they can take place outside. They're subject to the capacity, so the threshold of 800. But what's important with events is that this is not the language in the legislation, but it's a useful shorthand. Effectively, they should be ticketed. There'll be a sort of controlled access to those events. If it's simply something that's put on that people can just wander in and out of, and I think a good example of that might be, say, a cycle race on open roads. Yeah. The start finish. There's no way of controlling members of the public that will be there.
And park runs is one that's often been asked about, those types of situations where it's in an area that's used by other people as well. So I think there's been an increase, hasn't there, in recent years of these pop-up festivals and pop-up events that we've all seen in our communities. And so whether they then, if it's going to be in a perimeter where there's going to be, we know that there's going to be the footfall within that perimeter, then that's essentially going to be a qualifying event in terms of whether it's then picked up under the Act. So I think that's worth considering, particularly those that you're working in communities where these types of events are being put on. Certainly where I live, there's one of these sort of like mini festivals that's started to gather a pace in the last few years, and so it's gone from very, very small to definitely being, a very significant footfall. So the organisers have had to take due consideration of that. So
yeah, and I think if you sort of think, say, something like a music event in a park that might be ticketed to 1,000 or so members of the public and have perimeter controls, but you may get several hundred more kind of freeloading around the around those perimeters and listening to the music, etc.
Yeah, and I think then that's the strength of your perimeters as well. So that comes down to your security, to the patrolling of those premises, the competencies that we talked about before in relation to the security personnel, and the physical sturdiness and reliability of those perimeters. That's something that, you know, organisers are going to have to consider as well.
Yeah, but just from a sort of general risk point rather than a legal point, if you've got an event like that where non-ticketed members of the public can sort of hang around the perimeter, etc., those within may be subject to, you know, and the event may be subject to the legislation. But it makes pretty good sense to anticipate what sort of other members, what the nature of the attendance of other members of the public might be, even if they're not strictly in scope. And I suppose, you know, right at a much lower level, if the premises aren't in scope at all because they're not going to get attendance more than 200, at least somebody having knowledge of Martyn's Law and what it means generally, even if the premises isn't in scope, you know, is a sensible, practical, well-informed thing to do for anyone in charge of health and safety at a non-qualifying premises to do, just as a matter of sort of, you know, general awareness.
There's been a few questions regarding control of premises. If I can just, that's something I think Karen, you asked a question there about 3 outdoor centres which come below the capacity of 200. However, we occasionally hire out premises to other organisations for conferences or events, and this has pushed it over 200. So would the hirer be responsible or still be incumbent upon our organisation to meet those needs? So again, it comes back to who is controlling the premises, doesn't it, Alistair? Who has control for that event in relation to those particular premises, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think not necessarily just in that example, but more broadly speaking, it is possible for there to be more than one responsible person in respect of premises or events. And the obvious example that people trot out is the multi-tenanted shopping centre.
Yeah.
Where the management company employed by the landlord would ordinarily have responsibility for the common parts. The large retailers will have responsibility for their own premises within the shopping centre. And indeed, if you've got a very big department store that's got sort of separate franchises within its premises, there may also be another responsible person there. And the Act introduces a positive duty of coordination and compliance, where you do have these multiple responsible persons. And in those situations, some form of advanced liaison will be expected by the regulator. And that takes you into issues around contractual indemnity, terms, etc., in leases and subleases, which is well beyond the scope of this talk, but something I think for those of you who may be encountering those situations to think about as you begin to understand Martyn's Law a bit more.
Yeah, there was a question about the Licensing Act being updated as well. There's a question about that, and that's something that we will come back to you on, because as far as I'm aware, there isn't a plan as such yet, but obviously we need to, the legislation evolves, doesn't it? And other legislation is impacted. So we'll come back to you on that. I think there's quite a few questions around the SIA and their role. I think it's important it isn't yet in situ, is it, Alistair? So it's evolving. But it's interesting that that there is going to be an awful amount of expectation on them from the outset, and are they going to adopt a softly approach in relation to inspections from the outset, so they're there in the capacity that HSE always used to be in an advisory as well as enforcement role? It really does depend on how of their resources, essentially, I think. So, and also the information, I think somebody's asked about information being shared with insurers around their preparedness for terrorism. I would imagine that as part of any due diligence by the insurers who are advising with the brokers in relation to coverage, and I defer to those people far more qualified than I in relation to this, and underwriters. There will be a considerable amount of due diligence being undertaken by capacity providers in relation to your preparation for these. So just as you would provide them with risk assessments, you know, fire risk assessments, whatever it might be, I'm sure that this will fall under the umbrella, which, although Alistair said, you know, we're looking at probably next year now, this coming into force, your policies that are going to cover this period may actually be incepting sometime later this year or very soon. So it's worth, obviously, these conversations are, I'm sure, will be taking place both internally and with your insurance advisors as well.
Yeah, I think sort of awareness of Martyn's Law, what you're doing, what you plan to do, how you're going to respond, etc. You could see that certainly for larger businesses, maybe sort of mid-corporates, that form part of the pre-inception disclosure process and information that should be shared with an insurer. I think it's squarely falls within that. Yeah.
Are there any other questions, Lisa, that you wanted to pick out? As we will, as I said, try and respond to all of these. But is there anything in particular that some of them have a common theme, so where there is, so we'll bring those under one umbrella, but we will try and get back to everybody with some responses. So anything from your point of view, Lisa?
No, I think I'm just conscious of time. I think I was going to talk about the SIA, and you've covered that one. So I think because there was quite a few questions on that, I think the rest we will have to pick up after. But yeah, I think I just really wanted to say thank you again for presenting. It's been very, very informative. Also, thank you for everyone who's joined the call. We've had really good numbers and lots of questions. So as we said, we'll send the recording out to everybody who's on the call. Helen said that she's happy to share the slides, so just bear with us and we'll try and send everything out next week at some point. We'll also share contact details as well if you've got further questions as well for Helen, Alistair or Zurich. And yeah, no, just a big thank you to everyone joining. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.